University of Waterloo is so proud to be part of this community and to host these community lectures that allow us to stay connected. During uncertain times, access to the facts is especially important. We are delighted to bring our researchers to your homes to share their expertise on topics right from the headlines. Prior to the pandemic, we launched the series in partnership with the CBC Kitchener-Waterloo. We are pleased to be bringing it back today, again, in partnership with CBC Kitchener-Waterloo, just now online. The Beyond the Headlines online series has been formed through collaborative efforts between University Relations, the Faculty of Applied Health Sciences, and the Faculty of Arts. Thank you to all that have been involved. Before I turn things over to start today's lecture, a quick reminder about housekeeping items for today. To change the layout of this video chat, hover over the gray button in the top right-hand corner of the video screen. If you have any questions for our speaker, please direct questions to all panelists using the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties, feel free to message the host directly via chat. And a reminder that today's session is being recorded and will be available to view on the University of Waterloo's YouTube channel. It is now my pleasure to introduce Feridun Hamdulapur, who is President and Vice-Chancellor at the University of Waterloo.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much, Lily, for the intro. And I'm so delighted that you could join us this afternoon. I should also thank our panelists who came forward for this very important conversation, and of course, Craig Norris, our great partner for to moderate this session. As Lily mentioned, some time ago, we decided that there are so many important issues that we are all concerned about, we are all talking about, and we needed to bring the university to the forefront to enable a deeper conversation, whether it's regarding fake news or whether it's regarding democracy. We wanted to join with our community and have these conversations. And we launched a few of them in the past, but this is the first time that we are doing this online, and we hope that we will continue in one fashion or another dealing with some really important issues. COVID-19 reminded us a number of things, as awful as devastating it has been to many countries, communities from social, economic, health perspectives. It is also making us rethink about a number of things. We spend enormous amounts of time talking about globalization, promoting globalization, and all of a sudden we said, no, wait a second. Maybe we should talk about not deglobalization. We should talk about our own supply chain issues. We should talk about our own sustainability of food or technology or other things. And there's a lot of conversations. They are not necessarily in conflict with each other, but they complement each other. For that, I think we have a very, very rich, we will have a rich conversation. And I'm delighted again with our panelists who are willing to come forward and get this conversation started. So with that, I'll turn it over to our moderator, and thank you again for your participation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, President Hamdulapur. Lovely to see you with the bookshelves behind you. That's lovely. Welcome, everybody, to the panel. I am on my phone. I'm not on a laptop, so I hope everyone can hear me and see me okay. I hope it's good. The way it's going to work this afternoon is we're going to hear from 3 speakers, and then we will open it up. We'll have a short conversation between me and the panelists, and then we will open it up to you, all of the viewers, for your questions as well. And those will be moderated. We have some that were sent in advance, and we will get to those as well. With us today is Bryan Grimwood. He's an associate professor and associate chair for graduate studies in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies. His interdisciplinary social science research analyzes human nature, relationship and advocates justice and sustainability in context of tourism, leisure, and livelihoods. Now, in 2018, Bryan was awarded the Awesome Scholar in Tourism by the Women Academics in Tourism, an international group of tourism academics committed to advancing values-engaged scholarship and equity in academic publishing and career advancement, as well as Emerging Leisure Scholar Award from the Canadian Association for Leisure Studies. Bryan is the co-founder of the North American branch of Critical Tourism Studies. We'll also hear from Sue Horton. Sue is a professor in the Department of Public Health and Health Systems and is currently the deputy chair of the Lancet Commission on Diagnostics, which aims to report in the summer of 2021. Her areas of specialization include diagnostics, cancer, micronutrients, undernutrition, as well as the double burden of nutrition and a wide range of other interventions. Her current research focuses on economic aspects of global health, which includes cost effectiveness, cost and prioritization of interventions of many kinds. And finally, Dr. Besma Momani is Assistant Vice President of International Relations. She's a full professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG as we know it, and a non-resident fellow of the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Momani currently sits on the National Security Transparency Advisory Group to advise the Deputy Minister of Public Safety and other government officials on improving transparency to Canada's national security and intelligence departments and agencies. She's a frequent contributor to international media on international affairs and writes regular op-eds in the Globe and Mail and Time Magazine, and you've probably seen her a few times on Power and Politics on CBC News Network as well. And as you can see, we're going to it's breaking it up into sort of three different areas. We're going to talk about our tourism and our travel aspects, our health aspects. And at first up will be Dr. Momani, who will talk about the international relations and sort of the geopolitical aspects of this. So without further ado, here is Dr. Besma Momani.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for this opportunity. And wow, the international political system is in a muck, to say the least. Look, there's lots going on. I'm certainly watching the fact that we are waiting for a UN Security Council seat vote today, and it says a lot about whether or not Canada is really back, something that many of you have been following perhaps as a mantra of particularly the Trudeau government, and so we'll see if that really comes to fruition. But in terms of sort of my assessment of what's going on in the international political system, I'm a political economist by training, so bear with me. I see things as both, intertwined. The politics and the economics are really coming together, and it's frankly not a very optimistic picture that I have. There's lots of things happening. Certainly, I think we all see the fact that our economic system is struggling. It's partly because all production and consumption has pretty much come to a halt as we were in lockdown. Some of that, of course, as discussions around supply chain have exposed, is because of our interdependencies. Let's not kid ourselves. We spent a lot of years globalizing, which we all thought was great. It was efficiency. It was cheaper products, and definitely in terms of how smooth it once ran, we thought it was all great. But what we realized is that just-in-time delivery, which is a concept that, you order it, it comes from China, in 2-3 days it's at your doorstep. That's just not going to work very well in a time when you have figurative and literal borders back up again. So that's a big challenge. And then in terms of, once you have all those economic factors come in, we've spent a lot of months trying to keep people afloat, quite literally, I think, when you think about all the money that's gone out the door from governments, which was the right thing to do. I'm not, quibbling on that. And I think a lot of macroeconomists, I'm mindful of, countries like Germany, certainly, of course, Canada, but even organizations like the IMF, which I worked for at one time, are really the bastions of, fiscal conservatism, right? And they're saying spend, spend, spend. Nobody wants, people to fall through the cracks right now, especially now. But it does come with a reckoning, and that's taxation. And we're all going to be facing, I think, a big tax bill at some point. We're going to all be looking for how are we going to get out of this economic slump, and that is going to think. We're going to have to think about the recovery. I'm mindful of some amazing colleagues who are working on this. I'll butcher their names, so bear with me. I'll refrain from trying to play with their names. But I've heard two concepts that really stand out to me, which is let's not have shovel ready, but shovel worthy projects. In other words, if we're going to rebuild, let's rebuild right. There's a lot of discussion about how are we going to go back. Can we create a better society, a more just society? Everybody's talking about working from home, and what does that mean in terms of how it's going to change things? I'm mindful that if we have a work from home world, what does that mean to the way we organize our cities? What does that mean to the fact that we've invested all this money in mass transit, which was a good thing we thought, right? What does it mean for the fact that we have so much commercial and office space out there? Think of the downtown Toronto core, the downtown Kitchener-Waterloo core. They depend on the high rents of office space. What does it mean for the restaurants around it? So the economic fallout of this is pretty significant. And so it's all going to catch up with us. I'm not afraid of using the word that it's going to be an economic depression. That's where I think we're going. But what makes me even more pessimistic, ironically, it's not just the economics, it's the politics that comes with it. Because the political side of this is that we're far more polarized than ever, both right and left. And it's not just a US thing. This is, we often look at the United States and are not often conscious of the same polarizing trends. Well, this is a recipe for a lot of hardened views about, okay, we've spent a lot of money, now it's time to be fiscally conservative. Well, I mean, the progressive on the left, center left, have been asking for more investment in this, in a green stimulus. We hear people talk about even more money in healthcare. All of that, kind of to me suggests that there's going to be this clash of political ideologies, and I think it's going to mean that we're going to be even more polarized. And again, we're all looking at the United States because it's all coming to a head this November, but I see the undercurrents of the same challenges here in Canada in terms of the right and left very polarized in their views, and making this conflict or making this COVID situation and the economic crisis as vindication of their views, right? And so that polarization is something that really, I think, keeps me up at night. And so, as you can tell, I'm on the pessimistic side. As I always say, I hope I'm wrong and everybody else is right, particularly those optimists, because it doesn't look good. And that's my world encapsulated in 3 to 4 minutes, and hope that we can have lots of time to discuss.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bassamo-Omani. Well, maybe realistic. We won't say cynical. We'll say realistic. We were going to discuss more about the geopolitical part of this at the end of the panelists. Our next panelist is Sue Horton. Let's welcome Sue Horton now.
Hi, Craig, and welcome to all those who are listening in. So my work's on global health, and as mentioned, I'm the Deputy Chair of the Lancet Commission on Diagnostics, which hopes to report next year. So when the COVID came along, I had at least started to learn all the medical things about diagnostics, which was really useful when suddenly this barrage of information about COVID came along. So diagnostics are really important. It's like real estate, where you talk about location, location, location. So in diagnostics and in infectious disease, testing is what's really important. And without it, you end up doing things like empirical treatment or symptomatic treatment. You treat what you think the patient has, but you can end up causing worse outcomes for the patient. And you can also get into things like antimicrobial resistance, because you throw antibiotics at everything and then they no longer work when you really have something that needs an antibiotic. So so COVID kind of threw my work into a high relief. So I think the pandemic has revealed the interconnectedness that we have in health. So who would have expected that encounters with primates in Central Africa would have led to Ebola or to HIV infections, or encounters with bats in East Asia would have us locked up in Canada and in the Western world. And at the same time, the need for cooperation is ever greater. But as Besma has mentioned, we're at a difficult time, in terms of polarization. She highlighted what's going on within countries, and I also think about what's happening between the US and China. I was born in the UK at the time of the Suez moment, when the UK's vulnerability and its decline in power was becoming evident. And one wonders if the COVID pandemic is the US Suez moment, that it's putting into relief the decline in the US's power and the rise in the power of China. And that's a very bad time for everybody else in the world economy. So in China, there were initial missteps. It's possible China didn't reveal the full extent of the transmissibility of the infection amongst humans. Some people say it's because they were trying to gather as much PPE and as much testing kits as possible prior to the rest of the world realizing they also needed these materials. And it led to a kind of dog-eat-dog situation where everybody in the world is competing for the same medical equipment. And what's happening, of course, is that the poorest countries are the ones that are getting left out. So who would have imagined that the World Health Organization was going to become a political football? As Besma mentioned, the international architecture that governs international cooperation is kind of creaking under the stress of the changes that have occurred over the last 50 years. And the WHO, likewise, in the same problem, starved of funding. Who would have expected that its largest donor would suddenly pull the plug in the middle of the pandemic and stop funding the World Health Organization? So we have this real conflict between, science and fiction. Political expediency trumping listening to scientific experts. So how do I see the global world evolving post-COVID? Obviously, I hope and anticipate that there will be more emphasis on diagnostics, that we shouldn't be thinking about them testing simply for COVID, but we should be thinking about them in connection with all disease, because that's going to help disease outcomes to become better, and it's going to prevent us from wasting resources by treating things that are in fact not what the patient has. I hope that there will be more cooperation, but I've already mentioned the conflicts that we've seen with COVID about access to PPE, and also the future conflicts that we are anticipating over vaccines. We've seen some countries saying, we are first, we've put money into this, we deserve the intellectual property for this, and not caring what's going to happen in the rest of the world. I mean, it's a crazy way to think for an infectious disease. No matter how many vaccines you have in your own country, there are people who don't respond well to vaccines. There are people who cannot be vaccinated, for example, small infants. And the best way to protect them is for cooperation, that globally we need vaccination. But unfortunately, that's not necessarily what's going to happen. What's going to happen with the anti-vaxxers in our own country? Would we even permit children of anti-vaxxers to be in school when we know that they can potentially transmit the infection to other people and then to the elderly who are the most vulnerable to COVID? Obviously, there's going to be more virtual health following this pandemic experience. I just saw online this morning that CAMH in Toronto went from 300 online appointments a month to 4,000. For me, I love going to see my doctor over the phone as opposed to having to go into the office, and running the risk of catching infections from other people in the office. And hopefully that's going to be something we will do more of in future. I would see the low and middle income countries taking more the lead on their own health. As the pandemic has prevented travel, they have been in the people whose capacity has been built up with our assistance have been taking more of the lead in organizing projects, aid-funded projects, etc. And I think that's going to continue. And then lastly, universal health coverage. That's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the more that we have of that, and the more that diagnostics are a part of universal health coverage explicitly, the better off we will be in case of future pandemics. And thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So many questions coming out of this, and we're getting some great ones in, and we will get to those questions. We will get to viewer questions very, very soon. Next, though, we're going to hear from Bryan Grimwood. Please welcome Bryan.
Hey, thanks, Craig, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday afternoon. It's really nice to be here and be sharing some conversation with colleagues from University of Waterloo. So yeah, as Craig mentioned in the introduction, I study tourism. I focus on responsibility and sustainability in tourism context. I identify as a settler Canadian with British ancestry. I'm a father of 3. I'm trained in human geography, so I look at tourism spaces and places, and I'm increasingly interested in the relationships between tourism and Indigenous settler relationships, and so I find it difficult to remove myself as a human, as a person from my scholarship, and I suspect some of that will bleed through in my comments and in how the questions come up today. But yeah, we were asked to think about this question: will we become more global or more local in our post-COVID world? And I think the simple answer to that is yes, absolutely, both. But I think for me, I sort of rejig the question to how will we become more global or more local in our post-COVID world? And the take-home point that I really want to convey is that while this pandemic has certainly brought a lot of pain and suffering to individuals and to families and communities, it's also creating opportunities to rethink and reimagine the kind of world we want to inhabit and co-create for and with future generations. So I think it's a great opportunity to reset our relationships to the planet and to each other. As individuals, as communities, as nation states, certainly there's some political and economic forces that we need to grapple with. But also, yeah, thinking about our futures as being more equitable, more resilient, more connected to well-being as a value. And I think tourism is certainly a big part of that process. It's one of the economic, social sectors that was first to collapse and close up. International tourism is virtually at a standstill. Yeah, and with all this happening, I think there's this desire to know what to do about it, right? And we're socialized to expect that we can figure out the answers, that we can control this and manage it. And I think what the pandemic has shown and is teaching me is that we don't always, and a lot of us really, is that we don't always have the answers, that there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's really uncomfortable. But amid that uncertainty, I think there's opportunities for dialogue, for creativity, for supporting and enabling other ways of knowing to come to the forefront of our social, economic, political systems, how we relate to the land and environment. It's an opportunity for reflection and slowness. And so over the last several months, I've been trying to give myself permission to sit with that uncertainty. And so what I'd like to offer, though, is just some observations, what I'm reading about in relation to tourism, some reasons for or some issues or things that worry me briefly, and then hopefully I can end on some optimistic points here to counterbalance some of the pessimism. So just, yeah, I'll try to be quick here with these comments, but Yeah, tourism, I think we're experiencing in the context of tourism a lot of mourning. Tourists are missing out in wanting to visit families, friends, and relatives. They're missing out on summer holidays. Those experiences, communities that are reliant on tourism are at a standstill in many ways. So the Northwest Territory is an area that I have done some work in. A lot of operators and businesses in that area are closed up for the season or have shut down entirely. So we're mourning tourism, but we're also fearful of it, right? We're fearful of tourists that are coming and arriving from certain places. So the xenophobia that's filtering in, communities not wanting to host visitors. So we see this in Ontario cottage country, where residents of those communities are concerned about tourists coming in and spreading COVID-19. Proximity tourism, there's this engagement with local spaces that folks are looking to. And so they're looking to engage with natural environments, urban spaces that they live in different ways, and wearing this tourist-like lens or hat as they're traveling around. And tourist hotspots where local visitors don't have the opportunity to explore or experience local attractions. That's part of this proximity tourism. So we saw news recently about Florence and local people being able to visit museums. I have a student who lives in Niagara Falls and is doing bike tours around town. But at the same time, the proximity tourism comes with certain impacts and effects. So just recently, the Grand River Conservation Area closed down 4 of its conservation areas for a weekend as a result of poor behaviors, people not following physical distancing guidelines, crowding, litter, that sort of thing. So we're dealing with carrying capacity. We see technology opening up new opportunities for tourism-like experiences for seniors, for other groups that are disproportionately at risk of contracting COVID-19, for children and families that are looking for programming. So some innovation in that area. We're also seeing vulnerable communities who are disproportionately suffering, and we see a lot about that in the media. But in the tourism context, that's certainly the case, where the pandemic's accentuating how social inequalities infiltrate tourism. What worries me, I think, has been already touched on, that we'll resort to back to business as usual, back to politics as usual. The pandemic has arguably led to poorer and a more divided world. So as pressure mounts to restart the economy, there's potential for that to be coupled with this focus on domestic tourism. Who's driving that? Is that going to be driven by political, economic, nationalistic self-interest, individual interest, or is it going to be which has the potential to overrun community decision-making about how tourism is developed or redeveloped, if any tourism is developed at all? So that concerns me. And then the optimism. The students I work with give me great optimism. The students in both undergraduate and graduate contexts are embracing justice and ethics and bringing that into the tourism world in very concrete ways and practitioner-oriented ways. So a student who's working with RTO4 on plans to revitalize tourism post disaster of disaster of the pandemic is bringing justice and ethics into the planning around that. We see new values infiltrating tourism, slowness. As we slow down, as the world slows down, the planet's breathing again in many ways. There's this public consciousness awakening that things really haven't been right. Slowness as a form of resistance, where we're consuming less and renewing ourselves, and there's well-being and health effects associated with that. Gratitude is another value that I'm seeing coming to the surface in both in tourism and in our appreciation for healthcare workers and essential service providers. And then the last one here is around diversity. For tourism to foster justice and sustainability in global or local contexts. We need diverse knowledges, diverse economies, diverse ways of relating to land and relating to each other. And so these social movements that are coming to the surface, Black Lives Matters, Indigenous solidarity, climate justice, all this stuff is bringing to the surface these horrific oppressions that are associated with the status quo. And my sense is that governments, institutions, the water public are listening and learning how things can and should be otherwise, and who should be supported to lead those sorts of change. So that diversity gives me great optimism moving forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you very much. We're going to just have a chat, but we can open up the other cameras. And I'm going to, I want to go back to something that Dr. Momani said, and it's something we hear a lot about. And it's not just about resetting, it's also about rebuilding, right? And starting from scratch, essentially. I want to, do we have Basma?
Yep.
I see her. Okay. Dr. Momani, I'm wondering, when you say let's rebuild and let's do it right and let's do it fair, I don't want to put you on the spot particularly, but what does that look like?
So I have to say, I don't buy into the let's rebuild because first of all, I'm a pragmatist, and it's expensive to rebuild. But that's the pull, and I think Bryan really eloquently kind of, if I don't want to put words in his mouth, but my point is that, you know, there is a view, and it does come from the progressive left, this idea that, look, all of the stuff that we've had isn't working for us. There's something inherently wrong in the system, and so we need to really think things. And it's a myriad of things, from our social relations to the way we organize our cities to the way we have our relationship with the environment. Again, maybe I'm a bit of a more of a pragmatist and a centrist, and that I think that's really difficult to do because it's very expensive. And, you know, we're in a fiscal crunch, and I think there's going to be a very hard sell to tell the Canadian public that we need a rethink. I think reform, I think change around the margins, which is not satisfying to a lot of people. And I'm very conscious of that actually a lot of people are like, we've been doing these tweaks at the margin and it's not working. I just think that in the fiscal environment that we're in, it's going to be really hard to reimagine. Now, the problem here, and this is my analyst hat, and this is not wishing anything. It's just that I think that you see the right and you see the left, and maybe it's, again, the vantage point of being in the center and kind of as an analyst kind of seeing it all on all sides. That really is the clash. I mean, if you dig deep and see what the right wing, the establishment in some cases, are saying, and how they're finding a lot of what is being pitched as ideas from the progressive left, you can see that there is a clash coming. And that's what I mean by, you know, a real challenge here. So for every time I see we need more money in healthcare, which I totally agree with fundamentally, but at the same time, you hear people saying, wait a minute, where is this money going to come from? Our tax bill is going to go through the roof. Where is the money going to go for investment in more green stimulus projects? Where is the money going to go into all these amazing initiatives that everybody wants from the progressive left? And so my analyst hat suggests that I think we're seeing that the two sides are highly polarized, feel like COVID vindicated their perspectives. And in many ways it did. From their perspective, it was very much a vindication, but it is a perspective. And I don't want to put a normative argument on it, because I'm not suggesting that I want to take sides. I only want, as an analyst, to say that worries me, because as a political scientist, that's going to make the future of our politics very, very contentious. And we see that already. I mean, you just have to be on some of these social media, and when you appeal to both right and left and the center, you get it all. And I think that there is something to be said about how the Canadian political landscape is going to get, and I don't want to say un-Canadian because that sounds very liberal of me, but less and less civil because of those views, those hardened views about where we should move forward.
Sue, I want to ask you, and this is another broad-ranging question, but we keep hearing nibblings around about vaccines, right? It could be tomorrow, ridiculous timelines for vaccines. Where does a vaccine leave us if one is developed? What changes?
Okay, so great question. And I think there's a lot of discussion. Typically, it takes a long time to develop vaccines. So some things I was reading on the weekend suggested that the first generation of vaccines are not going to prevent completely the COVID. It's just going to, in some sense, take the edge off, prevent the worst outcomes. So it might be somewhat like the flu. In that, it doesn't guarantee that you won't get the flu, but potentially you will just get it less badly than otherwise. So, yeah, I mean, but also you have to think, how are we going to vaccinate 7 billion people worldwide? It's like polio. Until you've eradicated it everywhere, it's not eradicated. It can come back. So, there are some aspects of the COVID vaccine which are good in the respect that it doesn't seem to be mutating, and that if we can develop a vaccine that works, we have a good chance of containing this pandemic. But on the other hand, the suggestions are it's going to be a complex and expensive vaccine to manufacture. It's not simply like the cowpox and smallpox, where a little dab of the virus is enough to inoculate you. It's going to be a complicated thing to manufacture. So on the other hand, because it's an infection, this is the way out. I mean, we've seen HIV that we have not been able to develop a vaccine, and the whole emphasis has to be on more prevention and also better cure. But that's very expensive, and maintaining that's very difficult.
So Bryan, when we stop traveling, when we stop experiencing, what do we lose?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well done, Craig. I'm gonna write that down and offer that up to my students in the fall when we start up class again.
Be it resolved that.
Be it resolved that, yeah, right. That we do lose something or not. I think there's an aspect of who we are as a species that involves movement and travel, and in connecting with others, connecting with the place and the surroundings that we inhabit and live in. So I think we lose a fundamental piece of who we are, and certainly like tourism as an industry has commodified that aspect of who we are, and for better or for worse. But my sense is like in the context of the pandemic, I don't think we've necessarily stopped. We've shifted or adapted in how we're exploring and how we're moving.
When we think about when you talked about one of the optimistic things that you thought about this was the diversity that we're seeing now, we're experiencing now. All of this is a pretty disruptive force, is it not? I mean, even the diversity part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is, and it's challenging me to rethink how I'm situated within our social world, how I'm situated within the place of Waterloo, in the context of the University of Waterloo as well. Mm-hmm. It is very challenging.
I just want everyone to bear with me. We're going to get to audience questions. There are many, many, many of them, and I just have to navigate through my phone to get to them. Back to Dr. Momani again. This is a specific question. In light of the anticipated fiscal deficit, and you talked about that, what are your thoughts about the public pressure to see funding to police redirected to social programs?
Yeah, and certainly been following that debate, and a lot of young people in particular. I mean, Bryan says he has a lot of faith in young people. My daughter's a student at the university, and I have a lot of faith in her generation. As I always say, what we put up with, they're not going to put up with, and I'm really proud of those young people who just frankly are not going to sit quiet on everything from gender to LGBTQ right issues to race to, all the discriminatory sector, parts of our society, how we treat Indigenous people, you name it. Kudos to them, and God bless them for existing. I almost lost track of your question, Craig, there, but the question about the fiscal space. Look, this is the challenge I see, is because look, we don't have. Look, I'm a political economist, so I look at what we have in terms of the bank, and it's depleting very quickly, and all of the programs and things that we're asking for cost money. And trying to relocate that and allocate that is going to be really difficult when you look at the rules of the game globally. Increasingly we don't tax corporations because the entire global, political and economic system is structured such a way that we're basically depending on people to pay income tax and sales tax. And if you look at how, very interesting, everything from estate laws to how, a lot of the innovation, and I mean literally innovation in tax law, really favors a lot of the wealthy. The reality is that, it's going to be borne by us, by the people who work hard, who are not in the top 1%. It's going to be absorbed by people who consume a lot, which tend to be, relatively speaking, more on the, because it's a regressive tax at the end. All of that is to say that, if we're not working, and a lot of people are not going to be working, a lot of people are on things like CERB, there is no money in the kitty. And this is the challenge that I think many of us who have great ideas for these progressive policies, but wonder, where is it going to come from? Now, this idea of this, shift money away from police and into social programs, into more mental health support, I love it. That's great, because that's a shift. I mean, that actually, you can say, okay, a little less here, a little more there. I'd love to see the fact that, particularly police forces, and I think Canada is still part of this problem, not get some of the military grade hardware that so many, police forces get lately. Part of that, as a security specialist too, is, part of the post 9/11 world of putting money into sort of anti-terror units inside the police. We need more actually computer scientists nowadays, because the real war is in cyber war and cyber security. And the thieves out there are really on the cyber realm more so than really breaking and entering. So there's a change even in where we need to put our resources in the police force. So all of that conversation is very healthy. We need it. But again, be conscious of it, folks. The money, the pot, that the fiscal space that our governments have at their disposal is shrinking. It's shrinking, 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 and it's a global shrink. It's every government, the richest of the richest, are facing this in terms of their national wealth.
And this would have happened. The lack of money, is it been exacerbated, of course, by COVID-19, or do you think, had it not been for this, the police would be like, yeah, let's rethink the way we're doing things here?
Oh, I mean, this has been absolutely, exacerbated by COVID-19, because the outlay, look at what governments have had to spend on. Everything from, again, the simple one is looking at CERB, but, I know that many of you had a chance to see our Prime Minister announce every day one initiative after the other. And as a political economist, I just saw dollar signs. Every announcement was another amount of money being put out there. Now, I'm not critiquing that in terms of like it was the right thing to do, because there's no monetary policy that we can play with. Interest rates are at their lowest. The only way to get us sort of, being able to get through this enormous lockdown was through that kind of stimulus, through the fiscal outlay. So it was the right thing to do at the time. But at some point, we have to do the calculations, and it's not good. It's not looking good for us at a national, at a national scale. Our fiscal consolidation will have to come at some point. And so all those great programs and ideas that we have to change and to rebuild cost money. And so that's the essence of the challenge I see. And again, I'm torn between what I want, right? Like, I want to spend money on lots of things as an individual. I just don't have that money. I mean, I can give you lots of great ideas that I would love to do in my own home on spending. I just don't have those resources. And that's the kind of decision making that politicians will have to come up with very soon.
It is the classical dilemma between the head and the heart. That's what we're talking about. Sue, I'm going to pull one in here from viewers. How does COVID and our economy's inclination to localize, other than globalize, affect the decision of who gets a vaccine when it's ready?
Yeah, that's a hard question because we are going to be reliant on a vaccine that's coming from probably one of 3 countries. I mean, there are 10 vaccines in trial, 5 from China. There are 2 in the UK. I think there are 2 in the US, and there's 1 more from Europe. So yeah, how can we localize vaccines in Africa or in Latin America? I mean, these things require so much capital that this has to be global. From the Lancet Commission on Diagnostics, 75% of the medical imaging equipment is produced by 3 firms globally. So that's not something you can localize, although there are efforts in that direction in that the tests for COVID, the British aid is working with Institut Pasteur in Senegal to produce $1 test kits locally. So, there are, on the one hand, there are the dictates of the technology, but on the other hand, the needs for localization. So, but if I can go back to something, if it's okay to say, that Bessa was discussing, I mean, one area I think we should go after in terms of money for reconstruction is inequality. I mean, who has been benefiting from us being locked down? Amazon, Zoom. But these people are very poorly taxed. I was a little sad, but mostly very happy when I saw that Netflix now is paying HST. And I think that's a direction to go. All these multinational corporations have gotten away scot-free from paying income tax by simply siphoning off their money into the Cayman Islands, through fancy techniques. I think those are things we should go after. And also as one of the last people in the baby boom generation who has not been harmed all that badly by the pandemic. I own a house, I have a garden, I have a salary, and I can't spend any money at the moment, unless I want to go online shopping because I can't travel. And in Bob Ray's days, we had the Ray Day holidays, and everyone was asked to do their share to help out those people who didn't have jobs. So maybe those are some things we should think about.
Well, they weren't the most popular days with a lot of people, though. But yes, we're going to take this is a question that came in beforehand, Bryan, and we'll throw it to you. Post-COVID, I mean, and we keep saying post-COVID, like there will be a post-COVID. Right. Countries like India and Brazil, how are they going to be seen by developed nations when it comes to things like trade and tourism?
Yeah, when it comes to seen by who? By folks in North America here?
Yes, by developed countries.
Yeah, I think that's where the worry lies with this focus on domestic tourism and the self-interest of nations and individuals maintaining individual health, public health for their citizens and for the people in that country. Yeah, and so borders being closed to certain groups, I can see sort of the intensification of some of the policies that the Trump administration put in around bans around certain groups. Yeah, and so I think that's pretty scary overall, and can exasperate what we've already seen.
And Besma, back to you. I mean, you can all jump in on this if you'd like as well. One of the themes that we're seeing in some of the questions is it time to start thinking about debt forgiveness? I mean, because we're all going to, almost every country in the world is going to come out of this with massive amounts of debts. Is it time to start examining this in a serious way?
Yeah, and I've certainly worked on this at an international level with what's called the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. Totally in favor of that because in so many ways, not just on a international scale, but certainly on an individual scale, but particularly on an international scale, much of these rescheduling of debts is really just meant to continue endemic poverty forever. And you do the math. I mean, there are countries out there that it would take 200 to 300 years for them to pay it off just based on their current income levels. I mean, it's just unsustainable, and it just, frankly, entrapped so many people in a forever never able to succeed. Is that a solution at a national scale in Canada? I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I haven't studied that. Whether debt forgiveness is viable, doable. I'm sure our laws would have to change significantly to do so. I think at a political level, I can speak that it will be very hard to pass. And again, that's not an indictment on whether or not it's the right thing to do or not, but just that I think it would be politically very difficult to do. And I don't see it coming from, either the center or right. It could come from the NDP, but even the NDP, I don't think in history have I ever seen that kind of language. I could be wrong. But yeah, look, it's an interesting idea. I've certainly advocated for it on an international scale. I haven't studied at a national scale, but it's an interesting observation and question. And as far as the banks, the banks in this country are very, they're strong. They tend to be united, not just in the Canadian Banking Association, but because of their small numbers, they act like an oligopoly in many ways and have a lot of clout with policymakers. And so it would be an uphill battle to get that kind of initiative at a national scale, politically speaking.
There's some really interesting conflicts and temporal conflicts here, right? Like when we're talking about politics, we're often like four years out, right? The next election, whereas like the debt is 200 to 300 years when we're talking about sustainability and relationships to land and future generations, right? Like that's a different temporal scale, and and so I think I'd be curious to know about conversations that could or should take place, or that maybe are taking place, about realigning some of the ways we think about politics and some of the ways we think about political leadership in Canada and elsewhere.
What about, Sue, one of the things we noticed too is how fast everything changed. I mean, Besma talked about working from home. That happened overnight. All of a sudden we could do it. It was like, oh my gosh, that was, so easy to do. One of the things that I think really blew a lot of people's minds, Sue, was how fast virtual healthcare happened on a larger scale. Do you see, now that we know it can happen, do you see that this virtual healthcare that we're experiencing now, do you see that changing the architecture or the landscape of healthcare?
Yeah, I hope so, because to me it seems like a very positive development. I've seen projects proposed for dealing with cardiac health of people in northern communities. You can't go there because you don't want to bring infection if you go and test them. But we do have the technology to do this. All these lab on a chip, these kinds of things are enabling us to monitor vital signs or to do certain kinds of tests in ways that it can be done remotely. In the Diagnostics Commission, we're talking about teleradiology, telepathology, transmitting images over space, such that it enables people to stay at home, but have experts in areas, with high technology to help to diagnose them. And I think that's going to be a good thing. My work in the Lancet Commission, we're very aware of people who are geographically deprived. They live far from from health centers. They aren't able to get there in time to get diagnosed. They may walk for 2 hours to get to the health center, only to find that the diagnostic test's not available. So the more that we can do those things remotely, we will help advantage those people who are currently very disadvantaged. So, I'm all in favor of it. And nobody likes sitting and waiting in doctors' waiting rooms. And so, this is a lot more convenient. We should be, triaging, using our healthcare resources for the most urgent cases that present themselves.
I'm being told we got to wrap it up, but I do want to get to just one more question, and it's a theme that has popped up here, and it was a theme that came in to a question before. If you can just bear with us for another 5 minutes or so, and maybe you can all weigh in on this. And I'm going to read the question that came in beforehand. Before COVID-19, there was slow but growing recognition that we must reduce our planetary footprint of GHGs and environmental destruction. With the unavoidable drive to build up economies, are you seeing hope that they may be built on a greener future? And if so, where and how can individual citizens amplify those areas? We'll start with Dr. Momani.
Oh boy, I don't know. Will we see more? I mean, look, I hope we get to see more, sustainable stimulus. And again, back to that shovel, worthy versus shovel ready. Which, by the way, the shovel ready tended to favor men in construction. It was a he covery as opposed to a she covery, as many economists are talking about. And so there's a lot of equity concerns there. But this roads and building and bridges, it's an easy, fast way for governments to spend money. And people always love seeing our roads being widened. I mean, maybe not everybody, but most of us who have cars, love to see more roads and at least wider roads, so less traffic. And so it's very easy to appease people, and it gets people back to work quickly. But that's not necessarily where the investment may want to go in. But I'm back to the point of, if we're going to see the digital transformation that we're all expecting in terms of us being home, I'd rather put that money towards really good broadband infrastructure, investment into 5G. If we're going to have the kind of digital healthcare, that requires a totally different broadband. 5G, of course, is a big part of where there's going to be a lot of hope and innovation. So I'd rather see that kind of infrastructure, investment than more roads. But yeah, I don't know if we'll get it because, again, it's expensive.
Sue?
Two things, cows and planes. So planes, we've all learned to do things more remotely. It's not a complete substitute, but I think everybody will go to fewer conferences. There'll be more virtual. It's not just healthcare, it's academic work. And cows, I mean, when I saw all that stuff about, slaughterhouses and people getting sick, it really made me think, oh, let's not throw that burger on the grill tonight. Let's go vegetarian. And if either of those two things happened, we'd be there for a greener future.
So, Bryan, planes.
Last words, eh?
So cows, maybe, but planes, we don't travel as much.
Yeah. We have. I think we, as in the Canadian, have a lot to learn from Indigenous peoples. I think the values that are informing tourism in different contexts, informing ways of relating to land. There's some recent work coming out by Maori scholar Anna Carr about the different ways that Maori culture is informing practices in New Zealand, and at the forefront of informing positive futures for tourism and for New Zealand society more broadly. And certainly, the work I've done with Indigenous communities in Canadian context in the Arctic and Ontario's near north are showing some different values that we might be able to learn from.
Time has flown by. I want to thank our panelists, Bryan Grimwood, Sue Horton, and Besma Momani. Thank you so much. It was amazing, and we wish we could go on for another hour here, but unfortunately we can't. This is a lunchtime, and I'm sure people want to sneak outside and grab some of that sun. Maybe you do as well. I want to thank you all very much for being a part of this. I want to thank everyone who watched as well online, and thank you for bearing with us when it comes to the technical aspects of all of this. I want to acknowledge the partnership between the University of Waterloo and CBC Kitchener-Waterloo. I'm honored to be a part of this. There will be the third, well, actually it's the second of the online ones. We had the first one in person at the Waterloo Rec Center, but the second and final panel is entitled Inequity, Responding to Inequity in Our Post-COVID-19 World. And you heard actually Sue Horton speak about that. That is going to be the next one, Responding to Inequity in Our Post-COVID-19 World. That's Wednesday, July 15th. That's online again. And head to uwaterloo.ca/community to register. Again, that's happening the 15th. No, it's the 17th. No, 15th is the 15th of July. Pardon me. I'm getting my dates, and I'm honored to have spent this time with you. Thank you so much to everyone for hanging out with us today.